Our text this morning is from the 65th chapter of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is actually a collection of books. It's a book written by three different authors that the scholars call 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah. This particular part of Isaiah comes from the same period of time that we looked at last Sunday with the prophet Haggai. It's that time period when the Jewish people have returned from exile in Babylon. They've returned to a country, and particularly a city, Jerusalem, which had been destroyed, and they are faced with the task of rebuilding it, and things are really, really difficult. And so this particular writer is offering some words of hope, and I think in light of what our nation has recently gone through, this is really an effective prism, these words that we find in this particular text, to examine where we are in 2016 as a nation. Let us listen for God's word. For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy, and its people as a delight. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in my people. No more shall the sound of weeping be heard in it, or the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant that lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. They shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be. And my chosen shall long enjoy the work of their hands. They shall not labor in vain or bear children for calamity. For they shall be offspring blessed by the Lord, and their descendants as well. Before they call, I will answer. While they are yet speaking, I will hear. The wolf and the lamb shall feed together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox, but the serpent, its food, shall be dust. They shall not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, says the Lord. And this is the word of the Lord. There's a website that a lot of people here in the city follow. It's called Gothamist, which focuses on New York City news. And this past week, it featured an article with Robert De Niro, the actor. Robert De Niro, who cut a video, you might recall, before the election in which he said he'd like to say and do a number of unsavory things to Donald Trump. Well, in the new video, he's moved from anger to grief. And what he said, I think, encapsulates the way in which a lot of people feel. He said, I feel like I did after 9/11. This is what he said about the election. He was being interviewed by an outlet called the Hollywood Reporters Award Chatter Podcast. He went on to say, we'll just see what happens, adding that there will be many, many, many people watching the Trump presidency and the moves his administration makes. De Niro, I think, does a decent job of summing up the confused, grieving feeling that a lot of New Yorkers and liberals and progressives have at the moment. I don't want to talk about this in a partisan way this morning, but it's impossible to escape the fact that here in New York City, 87% of the people in the 5 boroughs voted for Hillary Clinton. 87%. We have some clapping. New York City is the bluest of the blue urban areas in the United States. And living in New York City this week has been like living in a city that's in mourning. A number of people commented the day after the election that you could hear a pin drop on the subways. It was so quiet. People are really disturbed and upset about what is happening in our country. But I think at root, the grief that many people feel is not so much about losing an election, not winning a contest. You know, I'm a white guy from a red state, and I've been on the losing end of election after election for decades. I really understand what it means to lose an election, but I think that's not really what this is about, particularly for people of faith. Rather, it's about two very different ways of seeing the world. On the one hand, there are those who believe in a diverse America, one where religion or skin color or sexual orientation or place of birth aren't liabilities or deficiencies or considered to be moral defects. These people, and many of them, by the way, are people of faith, Christian and other, believe in inclusion and connection and interdependency. They believe in building bridges and breaking ceilings and in going high. This, by the way, is a very New Testament way of seeing the world. And we ought not to be hesitant to point that out. On the other hand, there are those who seem to believe in a very selective America, one that is largely white and straight, and a certain kind of Christian. And the voting, by the way, verified this. They responded to a campaign of fear and exclusion and isolation. And of course, this fear and anger for many of these people is rooted in decades of economic decline and desperation in many parts of the country. Having been raised and grown up in red state America, I can tell you that regardless of the way in which this is being portrayed, many of the people who voted for Trump are not racist. They are economically desperate, and they are willing to grab onto anything that might change their circumstances. This is the reality. The flip side is that a lot of them are racist. But the grief and anger today for so many, again, I'm going to say this, isn't so much about a political defeat. Rather, it's about a defeat for humanity. We're angry. We grieve because now this country may be less safe, less kind, and less available to a huge segment of its population. Those who have always felt vulnerable are now left more so. Those whose voices have been silenced may be further quieted. Those who always felt marginalized may be pushed further to the periphery. Those who feared they were seen as inferior now have confirmation in actual percentages. Hatred, fear, racism, bigotry, misogyny, violence, and intolerance. What we have lived through during the past 18 months has been deeply immoral. It's been deeply divisive. It's been psychologically damaging. It's been traumatic for our whole society, particularly for children. I want to share with you this morning something that a first grade public school teacher posted the day after the election, November 9th. She says, "Good morning, first graders. As many of you have probably heard, we have a new president of our country. The president makes big decisions for our country, but you get to make big decisions as well. Choose to be kind to people. Choose to do the right thing. Choose to love the things that make us all different and special. You don't have to be a grown-up to help make our country a better place." The tragedy of all this is that something like that has to be shared, has to be written. So this is bigger than left versus right, red versus blue. It is at root about how we understand who our neighbor is. It's about those who define the neighbor very narrowly and those who define it very broadly. And I might add that in Scripture, there is no limitation put on who our neighbor is. Our neighbor is everyone. Another tragedy about this election is that, they'll be examining all of the percentages and the statistics and so on. But the biggest tragedy is that 49%, half of the eligible voters in this country did not vote. 25.6 voted for Clinton, 25.4 voted for Trump. And we have a President Trump because of an anachronistic constitutional clause called the Electoral College, which exists because of slavery. So that's where we are. But that's not the final word. The worst part is knowing that these things have been amened by some of our neighbors, our families, our friends, those we work with, even those we worship alongside. That, I think, for a lot of people is the most horrific thing of all. We all know how close all of this is. And let's be clear, a truly Christian society, a society that believed wholeheartedly in love of neighbor, would not have tolerated or stood for what we've been through, but ours has and did. So many of us woke up on Wednesday morning in a home, in a country we no longer recognize. Grief, of course, and there are those famous 5 stages of grief that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross coined back in the late 1960s: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Grief, of course, always laments what might have been, the future we were robbed of, the tomorrow that we don't get to see. As a nation, we had an opportunity to affirm the beauty of our diversity, to choose ideas over sound bites, to let everyone know that they had a place at the table, to be the beacon of goodness and decency that we imagine. But as we've seen, about a quarter of the voting public said no. Which is interesting and tragic and ironic in light of our scripture reading today from 3rd Isaiah, this great text in which he lays out this beautiful vision of a new heaven and a new earth. And by the way, the writer of the book of Revelation basically copies this almost word for word in chapter 21 at the end of that book. You see, at first glance, we might see this passage as trying to lay out sort of a utopia of sorts that can never be achieved. It's not realistic. But what the writer's actually doing is that he's building upon the original creation that the divine, the one we call God, called good. So this is a story, it's about transforming the creation that exists, the world in which we live in, into something new. It's about moving from what is to what can be. To understand this vision of a transformed world, it may be helpful this morning for us to look at it through the lens of what the theologians call the incarnation of God. The incarnation of God. You see, the totality of Jesus' life provides a whole new framework for understanding Isaiah's prophecy. Jesus' radical inclusivity, his model of claiming power through nonviolent action, his ministry of presence reveal an unexpected model of messianic attributes. In other words, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection provide a new set of lenses for the world to engage in this new creation that God is already bringing about. Not as a goal to be looked for off in the far distant future, but one to be realized right here in the here and now. You see, the text describes the radical transformation of the living conditions of the Jewish people in the early 6th century and in New Jerusalem. Remember, the place is a mess. They're in poverty. The temple has been destroyed. The city's walls have been pulled down. They have to rebuild all the houses. Here is what the writer says is in their future. A low infant mortality rate, housing and food for all citizens, sustainable employment. And such details push us to focus on the manner in which Jesus' church, people like us, participates in his messianic rule. For example, we may not know how God means to transform the universe, but we can confess that it's in God's power so to do. Therefore, what remains possible for the single follower of Jesus, the single congregation like ours, is to do the work involved in such transformation by following the patterns of mercy that Christ has laid out for us. For instance, we are able to give one drink of cold water at a time. We are able to bring comfort to the poor. We are able to provide one act of mercy or change at a time. We are able to give one book, one friendship claim, one covenant of love, one can of soup or fruit, one moment in which another person is humanized rather than objectified, one challenge to set the order that maintains injustice, to speak against it, one declaration of the evil that is hiding in plain sight, one declaration that every person is a child of God. Together, these acts accumulate with God's grace. They make a difference. There is, of course, no denying that elements of radical suffering still exist in the world. We see them all around us. But in this text, we are given a foretaste of the new heavens and the new earth through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And I want you to think about it this morning in this way. Created by God, we are given gifts and the abilities and are invited to participate in the ongoing formation of the New Jerusalem for all the children of God, for everyone, so that we can work to diminish suffering wherever it exists. The question for us then is, how do we get in on what God is already doing? Well, we get in on what God is already doing by choosing love, by always choosing love. By choosing love, we always know that we're on the side of Jesus, that we're on the side of God. And for Christians, that means following and living in the manner of Jesus. It means choosing to live out the principles and the ethics that Jesus lived by as well. We choose to stand when we choose love with those among us who are crying out in anger and in pain and in fear. We choose to stand and to comfort those who grieve, to listen deeply to those who rage, and to shield those who tremble. We choose to say to those among us who fear what might happen in the months and years ahead because of who they are, because of the color of their skin, the smallness of their income, their nation of origin, their gender, or how they identify their gender, their religion, or because of who they love. We need to be clear that the Christian people, the followers of Jesus, that these will never stand alone. We choose to be the Beatitudes' voice in the halls of power, bound by no law but the law of love. Isaiah's words, however, are about much more than just personal solace and hope and those we love. Isaiah's words actually focus on communal salvation, a new way of life for a whole people. He's saying that God's joy is in creating the new and beautiful city. And this holy joy will be reflected in the lives of all people. Jerusalem, you see, is a metaphor. It stands in for all human communities everywhere, in all times, even and maybe especially those who have turned away from God, love of neighbor, and justice for everyone. The writer concludes in verse 20, toward the end of the text, with these words, "No more shall weeping be heard in Jerusalem, or the cry of distress." Ask yourself, what would human community look like with no one weeping? Well, as the writer says earlier in the text, people would not die before they had lived out a lifetime. How would such a community spend its resources? How would the common good be embraced when all people had the opportunity to live in the fullness of time? Well, healthcare, education, safe neighborhoods, plentiful clean water, environmental stewardship. What if all these human goods are not just the pipe dreams of social idealists, but are actually the will and future of God? Friends, the story of humanity has been and continues to be the story of struggle. And the one thing we can be sure of is that in that struggle, God will never leave our side. And so today, even as we sit, many of us in our anger, our sorrow, our pain, we still rise and we still choose. Choose love over hate, courage over fear, faithful resistance over acquiescence, inclusion over marginalization. That's how we help to build the new heaven and new earth that Isaiah is speaking of. And that's how we regain hope in the midst of our despair.